I thought you were going to ask a different question, which I'm going to answer the different question.
Okay.
Is why don't we just do it with an advisory board? Why do we need a fiduciary board to do all this?
Also, a great question.
Okay, so that's where I thought your question was going. I was preparing for it, but and so there's typically a different level of person that would be willing to set an advisory board. And the biggest thing from my personal standpoint is an advisory board doesn't need to have judgment. They don't need to have good judgment. They don't have to be schooled in a variety of things. They're not there to add broad perspective, broad and deep advice. An advisory board, oh, okay, we've got a problem with data analytics. Let's go out and get the best data analytics guy we can. We'll pay him as a consultant. He'll be on our advisory board, or her. Okay? It solves very, very specific, deep problems. Scientific advisory board, and a business advisory board. A lot of banks have advisory boards. Okay? They're there to serve the exact same purpose as nonprofits have regular boards. Fundraising. Okay? Most nonprofits tend to put people on their boards that can bring in money.
Right. Sure.
Either themselves or can attract money. They really don't care about judgment. They really don't care about, governance or anything. Don't tell us how to run this thing. Just bring us some donors. Okay. Well, it's the same thing with banks. They have large advisory boards that are there out in the community just to say, well, if you're thinking of a bank, you ought to try this bank. I mean, the bank that we went to came from a friend of ours who's on their advisory board. So that's different. A fiduciary board, you really are looking, and nonprofits, we talked about nonprofits earlier, they're typically very dysfunctional. That's one of the reasons, is they're not putting people on the board for the right reason. But and they tend to be very deep and narrow and specific. And most advisory boards don't meet regularly. They don't meet together, so you don't get the cross-fertilization. You don't get the brainstorming collectively that works up really good ideas or massages your ideas and gives you better perspective on how to make them work. And that works both ways. Fiduciary board, on the other hand, it's a check and a balance. Even though you can fire them if you want to, they still have the right and responsibility to vote no if they don't think what you're doing is right. If they don't think that what you're doing is in the best interest of the shareholders, in the best, and I've done this many, many times with companies where the chairman or the other person across the board table was the major owner, and I voted them down because I thought it was in their best interests to not do it or to do it, whatever the case was. Now, sometimes they outvoted me. Sometimes they didn't. I was on a board that had 7 venture capitalists, a founder, and me. And there were times, this was in the 80s, there were times when the vote started out 8-1. But for whatever reason, both the venture capitalists and the founder didn't want to do that particular action without a unanimous vote to cover their butts. I wouldn't change my vote. So there were at least 1 or 2 occasions where, after arguing into the night, the vote finally came 9-1 because they wanted it unanimous. They all agreed with me in the end. So it's a check and a balance. And so you can always overrule them, but it allows you, it keeps you from making a quick decision without thinking it through and without soliciting all of the potential information that you might not be aware of.
Let me add, you asked what's the difference between the two and how do I value it, that additional piece. Well, as Dennis said, in addition to everything Dennis said, let me give you an example. The fiduciary board member, you've got a resource that's very wide across the table, can adjust with any kind of deals that come in, any kind of decisions that come in. You want that kind of perspective. As he said, the advisory board may be set up for a special purpose. Let's say it was M&A. We're going to take 18 months over the next year and a half here. We'll take this 18 months and do some M&As. We'll acquire some companies. So Now I have a decision as management. Do I hire somebody full-time for M&A? And after 18 months, what do I do with them? Or do I get an advisory board with someone who has a lot more experience in doing multiple roll-ups? Right? And I can pay them a fraction of that cost because they're only going to meet once a month. And they're going to also bring a network of people that they have done with roll-ups. So there's how you would value that piece. And it's valued, do I have a permanent employee, or do I have an advisory board who's going to have a lot more experience? Or is this something we're going to do strategically all the time? Now I may decide to hire somebody on a fiduciary board.
And you don't have to structure that as an advisory board. You can
No.
just retain an advisor.
Yeah, you
the
can
most
just-
common today, I would think that the most common situation for dealing with cybersecurity risk is the board retains an outside advisor.
Yeah.
To
Very much
advise
so.
the board on, or to advise management on cybersecurity risk, because it's very difficult to find somebody who is a deep expert technically in the wide variety of potential cyber risks, who also has the experience and judgment to be a board member.
So they're advisor to the board and they attend the board meetings.
Yes,
but they're not technically-
when that subject is
Yeah.
in case. And so advisor, now you could have an advisory board, for example, a typical case for you guys would be that you go out and you pick 5 of your best customers, and you create a customer advisory board, and you actually meet with them periodically, biannually or quarterly. And all you do is say, hey, here's what we're thinking of doing going forward as a customer. Would this be a value? Would it not be? So they're a customer advisory board where the individuals that you've selected, you have enough regard for, and they're close enough and knowledgeable enough that you would trust them to tell them about those. Because you do have to, even with an advisory board, you have to let them in on the secret sauce. You have to tell them what's going on. And so with a regular board, of course, you have to tell them everything, and there's problems when you don't. But they don't give you quite the consensus and check and balance that the fiduciary board does.
Yeah.
So,
So is that, go ahead.
I would say in our case, as a closely held private company, right, like, there's not much, I mean, I guess the difference between a fiduciary and advisory in this case was, if we're bringing people on who we just want to get advice and get their opinion on it, it's kind of advisory. But if we put a fiduciary board, I mean, we would like legally put them in, they're voting on things. Yeah, you can remove them, but you literally then have to go through this whole process of saying, okay, let's call a shareholder meeting, let's vote on the board members again. And so is that kind of the difference in our situation?
Yeah.
Like, you're putting a little bit of a process, even though we can ultimately control
Yes,
them.
exactly.
You're holding votes.
It makes
They're
it-
saying you can or can't do this thing based on the vote, your vote counts.
Makes it a little more difficult.
Right.
Yeah, it makes it a little bit more difficult, that you have to stop and think about it and make sure that's what you want to do. Now, often in those situations, with the kind of cordiality that you would have in your situation, it would never come to that, because you're not going to pick people that are likely. You're sensitive enough. You're not going to pick people that are likely to be that strident in their objections. You're going to say, no, we understand what you're saying, but we're thinking of doing it anyway. And they're going to say, okay, well, we'll support you the best we can, even though we think it's a bad decision. It'll never come to that, and I've rarely seen it come to that. But that is
serious independent board member is not sitting on your board like an activist.
Right.
Right? They have a duty of care and a duty of loyalty. So they're going to try to pull the rope with you.
All right.
And another important thing in your particular case, you are not going to pay anybody enough
No.
that they're going to do it for the money.
Yeah.
You're going to compensate them for their time, but at a small fraction of what they make,
Yeah.
or would make, or did make. I mean, I've brought people on. But I brought one guy on a board who was making $1.25 million a year, sitting on 4 boards. Okay? He resigned from those 4 boards, and I put him on one of my boards, private company. Those were public boards. It was General Motors, Raytheon, Hewlett-Packard, and Hughes Electronics. And he'd been on those boards for 20 years, and I got him to join one of my boards when he retired. He had to leave the boards he aged out. And I got him on my board initially for 25,000 stock options. Okay? Now, he's gotten a few more stock options over the years. Now, keep in mind, that was in 2002. He still hasn't gotten a dime. We haven't even paid him expenses. He's gotten more stock options. Technically, those stock options are still not worth more than they were then because there's been no liquidity at all. But he's still the best board member we have, and we've got some visibility. So they're not going to. I've put several people on that make millions of dollars a year. Put them on a board where they're making $1,000 a month.
Okay.
For sitting on the board. Okay? They don't do it, you're not going to get somebody that's doing it for that. You're going to get somebody that's number one, may or may not have been on a lot of boards before, depending on what their demand is. You might get somebody that's really qualified now, but not experienced yet, that would join a board to be on a board. They're going to join it because they like you guys personally. They're going to join it so the people, which for me, the number one thing I care about first in evaluating a board is who's on it already. That's why it was so hard not to join that other board. That's the number one thing. Then what business are they in? Does that interest me? So you're going to get somebody that's really interested in your business. Somebody, if they're from the nonprofit world, they're going to look at what you do for the nonprofit world. They're going to think, my gosh, what a great thing. I'd really like to help that. They're going to do it for either who you are or what you do. And then the money is just going to be a justification.
Okay.
And you're not going to give anybody equity typically. Although if you were to compensate somebody, you might do what we call synthetic equity. You might give them a profit share interest. Not a voting interest, not an ownership interest, but on an annual basis, depending on how you keep the books, they might get a percentage of the profit or something like that, which is not anything different than you might do for certain employees.
Right.
But that, you can see from that just highlighted discussion, that's how you would value that, right?
For sure.